I've said this before, but governance in Voltaire will probably be the trickiest single thing that Cardano tries to pull off. The problem is that governance has to be adaptable. It has to be able to change to meet changing circumstances. It also has to achieve balance of power. The conjunction of those two ideas means that we have to somehow manufacture balance and consensus between competing arms of government representing competing interests while also getting everyone to agree that we can occasionally kick out the people making up those various factions. This will be no small feat. Sensibilities will be offended and enemies will be made. But this is what we're going to have to do if we want the greatest prize of them all. That is self rule. Ready? Let's go. Today, we are going to discuss the current status of Voltaire and SIP 1694 and how I think the architecture of SIP 1694 actually controls for a very bad outcome. It prevents a very bad outcome that I think a lot of people are overlooking. If your main problem with this image is not the intense overuse of George Washington imagery anytime anyone talks about setting up governance of any type, but in fact is that the eagle seems to be wearing a backpack covered in fur, or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. We need to talk about Voltaire again. But we're not going to go through every section of Voltaire. Why? Because we already did that in episode 502. This video right here, Cardano and Voltaire. I went through the entire Cardano improvement proposal 1694, which lays out Voltaire, went through pretty much all of the most important sections of that entire SIP. So if you don't know what's in the Voltaire SIP, come back and refer to this video, episode number 502. I'll put a link down in the description box. In that video, we talked about the mechanics of how Voltaire would work under this SIP, but we're not going to focus as much on that in this video. What we are going to talk about is why I think this is actually a very good first stab at governance. I think this is actually shockingly good. And I don't say shockingly good because of who wrote it, because of the authors. I say that because this was our first attempt. This was sort of the first public attempt by any of the founding entities or any other notable figure at laying out exactly how on-chain governance could work in a blockchain ecosystem. This is not just kind of good. It's, I think, very, very good. And we will find corner cases that break things probably in this framework. We will find holes that need to be filled. There will be a lot of things we would have to adjust and fix. There'd be a lot of, circumstances that would break certain things laid out, the way they're laid out in the SIP. Like the framework would need to adapt, as does all governance. Anytime you lay out any kind of governing system, there are going to be circumstances that come up at some point in the future, and you're going to have to change how the system of governance works to adapt to those new circumstances. That's going to be true of any framework for governance that anyone lays out in Cardano or any other blockchain. So no one's saying this is perfect, and it's not even finished. As I went through in that earlier video, there are a lot of things that are sort of left blank, unresolved, to be determined, to be announced in this framework. And I think that's on purpose because the authors of the SIP, I don't think they wanted to decide everything. I think they wanted to create exactly what they said they were creating, a framework. And then the community could kind of decide how certain things, would be laid out. Like the voting thresholds are a big category of items that are left blank in this framework. And I think that's probably the right approach. But let's talk about why this overarching framework has a huge amount of value for any blockchain ecosystem and specifically for us in Cardano. Here's one of the overarching problems with voting in any blockchain ecosystem. You can't vote by wallet. Why? because if I have 10,000 ADA in a single wallet and I see that there's an election coming up next week, what do? I don't want, if it's voting by wallet, I don't want just one vote. I want 10,000 votes. So I'm going to take my ADA and I'm going to put one ADA into 10,000 different wallets. Now I have 10,000 votes. Much better situation, but I don't think that's what we're going for. We don't want everybody to be dividing up their ADA into a whole bunch of wallets just so they can have multiple votes. We also can't really vote by human if we care about permissionlessness. If you don't care about permissionlessness, you can just say, oh, we're going to have KYC, and then you just have to show that you have a wallet and you are a single human being via KYC. We're going to make you take a picture, of yourself holding your passport up to your face, like you're registering for Coinbase or something, and we'll just do it that way. You could do that if you don't care about permissionlessness. I think in a lot of crypto ecosystems, and especially in Cardano, we do care about permissionlessness, and our permissionlessness is going to get infringed probably in a lot of different ways by government edict. But we don't want to do it to ourselves. We want to have sort of, to the extent we can, we want to have permissionless voting in our system of governance. So we can't do it by KYC either. So we can't do it by wallet, can't do it by KYC. So we're down to, unless you come up with something really creative, we're pretty much down to voting by ADA. Each ADA basically counts as a vote, or however you want to move the decimal points around. Every 10 ADA counts as a vote. Doesn't really matter. We're going to have to vote by ADA. Here's why that is also problematic, depending on how you set up your governance. So here is the famous donut on cexplorer.io showing which stake pools control all the delegation. So here's the problem. This tells us a bunch of different things. It also tells us how much ADA is in a centralized exchange like Binance. And we know from this donut graph, that figure is 2.77 billion, which is equivalent to 11.08% of the outstanding ADA. We've also got this stake pool group right here, Avengers, which I think everyone believes this is Coinbase for a lot of different reasons. And they've got 9.31. Who have we got up next? Wave. Wave has got 3.5%. Then we've got this group. Then we've got another centralized exchange. Then we've got this group. Then we've got Emergo. Then we've got ADA Lite. Then we've got one PCT. So you can see where this is going. A lot of the ADA is actually in the possession of these very large centralized entities. Number one is Binance, and number two is probably Coinbase. And then pretty soon we've got, some other centralized entities. So we want to avoid a situation where all of these ADA votes end up in the hands of CZ, Brian Armstrong, and Jesse Powell. I actually like all three of them. I feel like they're all sort of, original crypto people who in a lot of ways embrace a lot of the original ethos of crypto to the extent you can if you're running a centralized exchange. But we really do need fiat on-ramps. So, when they established those exchanges, those centralized exchanges, they were doing a service to crypto. We needed fiat on-ramps. We still need them, fiat on-ramps and off-ramps. So, they're doing a certain service. But to the extent you can be running a giant centralized exchange and still embrace the original crypto, ideology, I think those guys are guys who probably do that in a lot of ways. In some other ways they don't, but in a lot of ways they do. So I actually like them. Do I want them to be able to vote all of the ADA that they're holding on behalf of individual ecosystem members? Because it's not really their ADA. Some of it probably is. Like some of that ADA in the Binance delegation here probably does belong to Binance, but most of it, the vast majority of it, belongs to individual ecosystem members who cannot be blamed for doing the practical, convenient thing. It's more practical and convenient for some people to stake their ADA with a centralized exchange. We can't really blame them for that. And no amount of education at least so far, has been able to convince people not to stake with these centralized exchanges. So here's why this is important. There are going to be a lot of people in our ecosystem who are going to say, hey, let's not do this tricameral thing that is laid out in SIP 1694. So that tricameral thing is the Constitutional Committee, the DREPs, and the stake pools all sort of making up a different chamber of the legislative body. You may remember from the last video, I said this table is the heart of SIP 1694. This basically tells you how everything in Voltaire would work under SIP 1694. So we're not going to go into too much detail here, but just as a little, because we did in the last video, but just as a little background, the way it currently works is that we are the subjects of a triumvirate of benevolent rulers composed of IO, Emergo, and the Cardano Foundation. They operate on a 5 of 7 multisig. So there are 7 keys. 5 of the keys have to sign off in order for a hard fork to happen. And we also know from our most recent hard fork, or actually the one before that, our most recent hard fork that involved a lot of drama, that the even if we have the 5 of 7 key sign off, the 5 of 7 multisig among the 3 benevolent rulers, the SPOs can also block a hard fork quite effectively. We found that out in that that hard fork, that the SPOs, if they're not satisfied, the hard fork will not go ahead. So we already have the situation where we have the kind of the parties, basically the parties that would be in the Constitutional Committee, because initially it would definitely be IO and the Cardano Foundation, at least. It'd be a members-based organization, and they're trying to figure out who exactly would be in the MBO, but it'd be something like that. So currently, we're being run by a 5 of 7 multisig, kind of by the same parties, plus the SPOs. That's what we've got currently. This table lays out what would happen under SIP 1694. You'd have the Constitutional Committee, and they would get to vote on these things and say heavy check mark. So these are like treasury withdrawals, protocol parameter changes, hard fork initiation, updates to the Constitution. And if they decided that they didn't think they themselves should be a part of the Constitutional Committee, or they think the Constitutional Committee should be dissolved and reformed, they could also vote on that. The DREPs get to vote on everything. The SPOs get to vote in cases where the Constitutional Committee does not think it should be dissolved and reformed, but the DREPs do. The DREPs and the SPOs could kind of dissolve the Constitutional Committee with a vote of no confidence, and then they could decide on, so the motion for no confidence would happen up here, and then down here, the same 2 parties, the DREPs, same 2 branches, the DREPs and the SPOs could vote on the new committee and the quorum, which is like the voting threshold. So we also have this column right here, AVST, active voting. Active voting stake threshold, AVST. So basically, this is the voting threshold of DREPs. So even in situations where the Constitutional Committee gets to vote, if you don't meet a certain voting threshold of the DREPs, then the SPOs could vote here. So I know a lot of people have been looking at this and they're like, hey man, I don't like the looks of this. It looks like that Chuck Hoskerman still has veto control over everything. This is a puppet government. It's a puppet government, and Chuck Hoskerman, Chaz Hoskerman, has still got his little veto power over everything. I don't like the looks of this. I think we need to set out a brand new form of government. So I think that kind of sentiment is related to a misunderstanding of what I think the actual goal here is. The actual goal of all this is not to retain some kind of power, some kind of grasp on power for IO or the foundation or for Emergo or anything like that. I think they are really trying to do the George Washington thing, where everybody assumes Charles tells the story all the time, but they're trying to do the George Washington thing where everybody assumed that George Washington would be the king of the United States, and he came in, he was president, and they just assumed he would stay president forever. And instead, he left office. I think that's what this is intended to do. This is the true, self-rule thing. They created this Constitutional Committee, and sure, the Constitutional Committee gets to vote on a lot of the same things they get to vote on now, but they can also be removed. The DREPs and the SPOs can have a vote of no confidence and then make a new constitutional committee. This is the opposite of what you do if you're trying to retain power. What you do when you're trying to retain power is what Ethereum does with Vitalik. Vitalik has no official office, basically, so he can't really be removed. There's nothing to remove him from. Instead, he just rules on high by consensus. And sure, people can agree with him, but man, it's we've gotten quite a few years down the road here, and it seems like he is still extremely influential. I'm not sure if very much happens over there that he's not in favor of, or that he can kind of like at least ideologically, initiate. So I think that's what you do. If you want to retain power, you just sort of like say, oh, guys, we're ruling by consensus. Don't worry. But also, here's what I think should happen. And then that kind of happens. That's how you retain power. If you want to retain power forever, you just give yourself this sort of, unofficial position where everything is supposed to be done by consensus, but it's really your influence over that consensus that matters. That's the way you retain power. Not this. You don't give the DREPs and the SPOs the ability to remove you and make a brand new constitutional committee. This is not IOG trying to retain power. This is IOG trying to prevent a different bad result. And I think it's kind of a good way to do this. It's kind of a genius way to do this. The real danger is not IOG. They're basically working for free for us. IO, you could argue, yes, IO does own IO and Charles combined. I don't know how we break that down, but that whole faction owns a lot of ADA, as does Emergo, Cardano Foundation. They all have ADA holdings. So they have a vested interest, of course, in pushing the ecosystem forward. But aside from that, IO is doing a lot of free work for us, and they're not really getting paid. They got that initial allotment back in the ICO in Japan, but they haven't really gotten paid for all of this work they're doing for us. And going forward, they're not really getting paid. They don't have like a contract with us where they're getting paid. So do you want to kick out the like largest group of Haskell engineers in the world who are doing free work for your ecosystem? I think that would be an extremely bad call. That'd be an extremely bad strategy. Who's going to replace them? Some other company that's involved with Cardano that has like 10%, the number of people who can even code in Haskell, who have a very small number of people who really understand the Cardano architecture like IO does. We've got a pretty good situation here. We shouldn't be worried about our ability to kick IO out, which they're giving us. We should be worried about them leaving, or about a bunch of people becoming crazy and deciding to kick them out, and us no longer getting all that free engineering. We're getting all this free work. This is great. This is a great system for us, but I think it's really architected to prevent a different, very, very bad result. The donut graph over here makes it very clear what the actual bad outcome would be. The really bad outcome would be if we gave the SPOs too much power in governance. It's obvious. I am an SPO. I say that as myself being an SPO. But look at this. Binance and Coinbase are by far the two biggest SPOs. Together, just those two. And, I'm assuming Avengers is Coinbase. But CZ and Brian Armstrong by themselves control 20% of the delegation. The SPOs should have a place in governance. And it should have a lot to do with hard fork initiation. Nobody's questioning that. And I even do like the role that the SPOs have given voting in those certain cases in that table when the voting threshold of the DREPs hasn't been met. And I think the SPOs will do a great job in a lot of those cases. No confidence votes in the Constitutional Committee, great. Forming a new committee when the original committee has been dissolved, okay, great. But you don't want to do something like no third chamber in the legislature, just the SPOs as like a Senate and the DREPs as a House of Representatives. Because then it's basically like you have a US Congress where your two biggest senators, two senators who somehow control like 20% of all the votes, are corporations, giant centralized corporations who aren't even really citizens of your nation. It's like if, you know, I don't even know what's a good example. It's like if Toyota and Honda controlled 20% of the US Senate. I actually like those two companies, so maybe that's a bad example. But name two global non-US companies. If they controlled 20% of the Senate, that probably wouldn't be a great idea. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense for us to give 20% of the vote in a bicameral legislature to these centralized exchanges that, I mean, they basically tolerate Cardano. Like Binance has been really good to Cardano. Coinbase, I mean, it hasn't even been that long since they agreed to list us. We've got Kraken. Kraken's been good with Cardano, but they're somewhere else in this list. They're not even up here, and they've run into their own staking problems. So it's unclear whether Kraken, would be a part of this even going forward. But it's a really bad outcome if you give the SPOs too much power. These ideas of a bicameral legislature, DREPs, and stake pools is a bad idea. As much as it pains me to say this as an SPO, we kind of want to limit the power of the SPOs to decide governance matters, because some of the centralized exchanges that don't necessarily care at all about Cardano would have these gigantic amounts of the vote. And then beyond the centralized exchanges, you've got other centralized entities, Adalite, 1PCT, eToro, another centralized exchange. We go through and point out a bunch of other sort of centralized parties in here. We don't want them to have that much vote. So it pains me to say it as an SPO, but we want to limit the amount of voting power the SPOs have. If a stake pool operator wants more power than they would be afforded as an SPO, they should become a DREP. If they truly represent the ecosystem and people would vote for them with their wallets in a way that is directly correlated to deciding governance matters. Because of course SPOs would argue that they've collected this delegation, so therefore they should get a vote. But that's an economic determination. Like look at 1PCT. People are delegating to 1PCT because of low fees, not necessarily because they want 1PCT to decide policy matters for them in the governance of Cardano. And that's true of every stake pool. The delegation to a stake pool, other factors come into play, but it's largely an economic determination. And I do think the stake pool should have a role. But if they want a bigger role than is laid out in SIP 1694, I think they should also be DREPs. They should become DREPs, and then people could actually vote for them to have their voting power as a DREP. And that's a different determination than someone delegating to your stake pool. You might delegate to a stake pool because it seems like a great deal economically, but at the same time, you may not want that person deciding Cardano policy for you. So I think the part that some people are missing is that SIP 1694 does a great job of controlling this really bad outcome where we give too much power to the SPOs. And some people might not like me saying that. They might find it to be a little controversial, but this graph tells the story. Do you really want Binance to have this much voting power? Do you really want Coinbase to have this much voting power? Do you want centralized exchanges and centralized corporations? We've also got Wave in here. We've got, I went through this before, but we've got all these centralized companies and centralized exchanges. You don't want that much of the voting power centralized in these entities. I think this is part of the reason that I'm convinced SIP 1694 is by far the best idea for on-chain blockchain governance we've seen so far. And if you really don't want IO to have any power, I think it's a great deal for us because they're basically doing free work for us. If you don't want IO and the foundation or Emergo or whoever else you're concerned about, if you don't want them to have that power, great. You can just have your DREP initiate some kind of or actually, I think anybody can initiate a vote of no confidence, but you could easily initiate a vote of no confidence, and the ecosystem could decide if they don't like all that free work from IO, we could have a vote of no confidence and make a new constitutional committee. This is a pretty good, pretty balanced system of governance. And it does the most important thing. It keeps control of Cardano out of the hands of all of these centralized exchanges and centralized companies. I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking to yourself, wait a second, you're saying that giving the SPOs too much power is a problem because the centralized exchanges then will have too much power. But isn't it the same situation with the DREPs? Because while they have this delegation that's been delegated to their stake pools, they also have possession effectively of all this ADA. So they could also give their votes to DREPs. That's exactly my point, though. We don't want to give them double this amount of voting power because we can see right here, they've got, a very big chunk. The centralized exchanges and other centralized companies have got a very big chunk of the delegation. We don't want them to have this giant chunk of the delegation and give them a lot of power as SPOs, and then also give them all this power to vote for DREPs. We should limit the SPO part because at least with the DREPs, we have like a fighting chance. It could be that a Coinbase or a Binance or any of these other centralized entities, they won't decide to, it could be that they'll decide not to vote all of that ADA. They could decide, oh, this is not really ethical for us to vote the ADA we're holding on behalf of our users. But if they're the stake pool, we're kind of, explicitly giving them the right to vote. So, I mean, they could decide, hey, we're going to vote this anyways because we really want to influence, Cardano policy. So we're going to vote our users ADA. We're going to delegate those votes to DREPs, or they could even field their own DREP. We could end up with a Coinbase DREP, but at least then you've got like an actual person who is becoming involved in the Cardano policy world. Whereas on the SPO side, if we just explicitly give them the right to vote all of that ADA as the SPO, and the SPOs have a lot of power, that's kind of an explicit grant of power to Coinbase and Binance. Whereas they kind of have to make this, iffy decision on the DREP side. Do they vote their users ADA? Do they not? It's kind of it's a little bit touchier PR issue for them because they're not explicitly given the right to vote their users ADA. They may decide not to. So it might not be as big a problem on the DREP side. So at least we have a fighting chance with the DREPs. With the SPOs, we're kind of explicitly giving a huge amount of the voting power in that chamber of the legislature to these centralized exchanges. That's why I think the SPOs are actually the greatest danger to giving the SPOs too much power is the greatest danger to Cardano governance. I hope you're having a great week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.